like so many others, I sure miss browsing for books at Malaprops, but we'll get there eventually and have a cup of coffee in the cafe and buy a bunch of books. So I hope everyone keeps supporting our bookstores, and in this case, for sure, Malaprops. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to be with you, and particularly for an evening that's celebrating a book that's should have been written many, many years ago, but at last it's here. It's a story very well told by David Menconi. Step It Up and Go. I have a bit of history with the UNC Press. I've been asked as host to just say a few words about the press. I'm a three-time author going back 4 decades. So I've learned a lot about this very fine university press. In 2022, it celebrates its centennial 100-year anniversary, including a trip to Scotland, among other things. One of the country's oldest and most respected university presses. It indeed is a gem or jewel in the crown of the University of North Carolina and for our whole state. UNC Press publishes about 125 books a year. How they do it, the editing, the marketing, I don't know, but over half win awards. And they're books of general interest about North Carolina, about the South, ranging from history to culture to flora, and of course, music. In our book, UNC Press book, Wayfaring Strangers, we interviewed 43 individuals, from Pete Seeger to Doc Watson to Gene Ritchie. But I've got to say that initially we went first to David Holt as one of our interviewees, because David has been a great torchbearer for the traditions of the music in North Carolina and our Appalachians for many, many years. Many of you know him by reputation. He's a 4-time Grammy Award winner. You've probably seen him as host on a PBS program, David Holt's State of Music. He was a longtime music partner with Doc Watson. And I look forward to being with him in December for our 18th Swananoor Solstice in Asheville at Dinah Wortham Theater. So no better selection to be the interviewer about a book about the heart and soul of North Carolina, I would say, which is its music and art. So David, I'll pass it on to you to interview David.
Okay, thank you, Doug. It's great to see you. David Menconi is like a treasure here in North Carolina. If you're a musician and would like to have some publicity about yourself, there's nothing better than to get an article by David. He was with the News and Observer for 28 years, I think he said, and that's quite an amazing feat. And you know, the reader always respected what he said, and the artist always respected what he said. So David is a very influential music writer in North Carolina. And the new book, Step It Up and Go, sort of follows the trail of North Carolina music from early days up to the present. So David, how did you get the idea for this book?
Well, thank you very much for the introductions, everybody, and great to be here. And yeah, I was probably here about 10 years when it started feeling like there was a book that could be done here that could accommodate every style, not just a single one, but try to tell a single unified story, touching on everything from jazz to blues to country to heavy metal to punk rock, and trying to come up with a narrative arc where all of that made sense to be in the same book was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
But I've been at the N&O about 5 years when I undertook a fairly crazy project. It was a band family tree showing relations in bands, you know, with common members. And it took me months, and it wasn't 100% everybody in it, but everybody from the Red Clay Ramblers to Corrosion of Conformity, the hardcore band, were somehow in this constellation of bands, all connected together. And that really got me thinking about North Carolina music as this single thing with all these stylistic variations.
And I don't think anybody's done that before.
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. It did seem, you know, when I first started talking to UNC Press about it, 16 long years ago, it was kind of wide open, and nobody's really come along and tried anything like this since.
Was there an overarching theme that you found?
You know, sort of working class populism. I've always thought of North Carolina as the day job state, which is a state of mind as much as career. You know, Doc being a perfect example, he kept that very humble mindset. You know, even when he went pro, I remember another of his accompanists, Jack Lawrence, telling me that if Doc had been sighted, he probably would have just been a mechanic and picked a little guitar on the weekend. And he seemed to conduct himself very much like that, very, very modestly.
Doc always said that, but he also said that if family had money, he would have been an engineer. He would have gone to college.
No
But
kidding.
if they didn't have money, he would have been a plumber or mechanic or something like that.
Boy, Doc as engineer is fascinating to think about.
Oh yeah, he'd be a good
would
one.
have built. Yeah.
He could take things apart and put them together. And you know, I remember one time the heater in the motel room wasn't working, and he took the dang thing apart, blind, you know, and fixed the darn thing. So he was very good at mechanical things.
You know, I always wanted to ask you, do you remember the first time you met him?
Oh yeah, gosh.
The very first time? What was that like? What were the circumstances?
So I was traveling through here in 1971, and I was at the Livonia Bluegrass Festival. He had just played, he was playing solo, and he came and sat under sort of a brush arbor that was kind of the green room. Nobody else was around. And I went in and sat down and talked to him. And, you know, I'm a pretty curious guy. And I just said, how do blind people dream, Doc? I've always wondered that. And he said, we dream in touch. We dream in touch. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting that you can dream about touching. And then years later, 20 years later, we were doing a gig together. I said, Doc, you remember this guy who asked you about how you dream? He said, yeah, nobody had ever asked me that before. I said, did you mean that you dream in touch and feelings? He said, yeah, we dream in touch and feelings. So that's how I first met Doc.
Wow. That's pretty cool. That's great that you...
Go ahead. We can talk on and on about Doc, but I was wondering where you decided to start.
I started with Charlie Poole about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
He just seemed like a good first in a number of ways. You know, he was one of the sort of forefathers of bluegrass. He did songs that are still played on the circuit today. And he was kind of a proto rock star too, the way he carried himself and lived his life. He was quite a character.
Tell us some of those stories.
Oh my gosh. Oh, it's remarkable how well he's remembered, given that there aren't any films of him performing. There's just some records and then stories that have been handed down from generations. You know, this was the Roaring 20s, and he'd go around playing speakeasies and places of ill repute. There's a story Kenny Rohrer tells about him, and of course Kenny Rohrer's biography of Charlie Poole is absolutely essential, about how they were the law was trying to arrest them one night, and Charlie turned his banjo into a weapon and actually banged somebody over the head with it.
Yeah.
And, he got arrested for that, and cost his wife $100 to get him out of jail, which was quite a sum of money in the 1920s.
He was the guy that just flat didn't give a damn. I mean, he would just do anything. They would get together and drink moonshine and gamble and play music in this building that was built on the Virginia-North Carolina line. So if the Virginia police came, they just walked to the other side of the building. If the North Carolina police came, they walked to the other side. Tell him that story about about how he hurt his hand and it became the kind of the perfect.
Oh yeah. As a young man on a well-oiled dare, he bet a friend that he could catch a baseball no matter how hard he threw it. So the friend
with no glove,
just his bare hand, and he winds up and flings it at him hard as he can, and he started to close his hand too soon. So the baseball at very high velocity goes crashing into his hand dead on, and the finger and broke his hand basically, and the fingers didn't heal exactly right, and you know, sort of a claw, you know, sort of
like this. So it made it perfect for playing 3-finger banjo.
Yeah.
That's how his style developed.
our musical lore is the richer for it, that the ball hit him at just the right angle for that.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty amazing.
I should note here that Mr. Holt is in this book. He's in the Doc Watson chapter, quoted a number of times, and there's a little sidebar bit about him that I might read a little bit later on as we get into this.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that.
Well deserved. Well, it wouldn't be right not to have you in there. You're quite the ambassador for North Carolina music.
Thank you. One of the interesting stories to me about Charlie, I know you mentioned in the book, but he was a total alcoholic. I mean, he died at, what was he, 33?
39 years old.
39 from drinking. And he got on a spree because he had been out of work. This is what I heard. He was and then he got a message that he was going to be in a movie out west in Hollywood. And so his luck had changed and he started drinking. And what did he drink for? He drank for 3 weeks or something like that without
something
stopping.
like that. Just an epic 3-week bender that he wound up not surviving.
Killed him. I mean, amazing that, you could even hold that much liquor.
Yeah, he had a remarkable capacity by all accounts for everything. Are you familiar with the Loudon Wainwright tribute record about him, High, Wide, and Handsome?
Oh, yeah, that's really good. Really good.
He really kind of captured him, I felt like.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
For people who don't know Charlie Poole, he was an interesting character because he played Tin Pan Alley tunes as much as mountain music. And they were very crisp, and he didn't play Scruggs style banjo, but the banjo style that he did play just made it just clunking along, really perfect timing. And he had kind of one of these kind of voices, where you talk like this sort of, but he was in perfect tune. It's kind of hard to listen to, but he had a great sense of tune and timing. And I think that's one reason people were so drawn to him.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's chapter 1, Charlie Poole. And from there it goes through Durham Blues, Blind Boy Fuller and those folks.
Talk about
Arthur's. The Durham blues scene in the 1930s, it's not well remembered, but Durham was as important a blues town as there was in America. Blind Boy Fuller, Reverend Gary Davis, Sonny and Brownie, the Trice Brothers, Floyd Council, they're just, a veritable hall of fame was living and playing in Durham. And there weren't nightclubs, so per se, it was mostly a thing where they'd be playing at house parties, and they'd busk a lot in and around the tobacco warehouses, especially during tobacco harvest season. The farmers would come in with their leaves, and then they'd be a captive audience. And then after they sell their crop, they'd be flush with cash. So they'd hit the shopping district, the bootleggers would come around, and then the musicians too. So yeah, it was quite a thing.
Some of those guys came up to Asheville at that time, and Reverend Gary Davis, and we had two street musicians. Some of you may remember Walt and Ethel Phelps, and they were not very good musicians, but they were the real deal, and they had learned from all those guys. And they would play out at McCormick Field and lived here in Asheville till they passed away in about 1985, something like that. But they were an outreach of that Durham blues scene, which was really impactful in the whole blues world.
Yeah. And there were satellites in, Winston-Salem, it just, kind of wherever there were tobacco warehouses and people coming in to sell tobacco, you'd find blues, especially in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Yeah, right. And then you were about to talk about
Arthur Smith.
Arthur Smith, yeah.
Yeah, Arthur Guitar Boogie Smith, as opposed to Fiddlin' Arthur Smith. But he was a visionary, absolute visionary, businessman as well as musician. He contributed a couple of really key instrumentals that are well remembered, Feudin' Banjos, although you know it as Dueling Banjos, and Guitar Boogie. And he also had a syndicated TV show out of Charlotte for about 30 years called Carolina Calling, and everybody played it. It was, years before Hee Haw or Porter Wagner, this other stuff. Arthur Smith did it first.
I tried to go see Arthur Smith, but he was 90 years old, and his son said, no, my dad just isn't taking any more visitors, but I'm sorry I never got to meet him. Did you ever get to meet him?
I did. It was an extremely memorable interview. basically in his office. And, he was running the fishing tournament by then, wasn't playing so much, but it was, I don't know, probably 20 years ago or so. He was winning a North Carolina Folk Heritage Award. And what I remember most about the conversation is when he was telling the story about the lawsuit over the song Feuding Banjos. He's sitting there at his desk cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife as he's telling me how he raked Warner Brothers pictures over the coals and won that case sort of unexpectedly.
Did he get any of the back money on that? Because I know the horse had left the barn by the time he brought the suit.
Oh yeah, he got a $200,000 award, which is a lot of money for 1973.
Yeah.
And and he said he got a very nice check every 90 days after that too, because it was just still so much in the air. And some awards that it won were transferred to him. And he declined to get a credit in the movie because he found it offensive, which I was
found the movie offensive.
Yes.
Huh.
Deliverance. Yeah.
Yeah, Deliverance, exactly. It's the tune that goes da 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 da, and then the guy sitting on the porch catches it back. It's that tune, and I guess Eric Weisberg thought that he was playing in a traditional tune when he put it in the movie. I don't think he thought he was stealing it from Arthur Smith.
Yeah, everybody involved thought it was just one of those old mountain songs that you could lay claim to, and no, it really wasn't.
The other cool thing about Arthur Smith is the James Brown. James Brown report.
James Brown, yeah.
He had a recording studio. Tell about that.
Yeah, Arthur Smith Studios was kind of the place to be. They did a lot of beach music, a lot of everything. And Arthur Smith said he used to get up about 4 o'clock in the morning to get down in time for the show because it was crack of dawn. And it was right before he was going to get up, his phone rings and it's James Brown saying, yeah, we ain't had a hit in a while. I understand your studio's a good one. He said, well, you ought to come on in. So he came in, and that was where and when they did Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which kind of launched Brown's career to a whole new level and also created funk music. But Arthur Smith Studios was the rather unlikely venue.
You really? Where did you go next in the book?
From there, over to Winston-Salem, the Five Royales, Chapter 5, fittingly. And the Five Royales were one of the key R&B groups in the evolution of music from gospel to R&B. They started out as the Royal Sons Quintet. And their gospel records weren't really selling, so they decided to give the secular side a try. And their stuff was bawdy enough to make a deacon blush. They would be there on all these compilations with names like Gabe's Dirty Blues or Risque Rhythms. Songs like Laundromat Blues. And if you listen to the lyrics, it's clearly not about washing your clothes.
A single entendre,
huh? And they too left behind some real signposts. Dedicated to the One I Love was a Five Royale song before the Shirelles or the Mamas and the Papas got to it.
Yeah, I started listening to it after I read your chapter because I didn't know them, and they were quite good.
Amazing stuff. There's a couple of really good compilations out there. It's all good, and they kept at it well into the 60s before they finally gave up. But the 50s was kind of their prime era when they were moving things along. Booker T and the MGs learned a lot from Five Royales. Steve Cropper, the MG's guitar player, has always credited Loman Pauling from the Five Royales as a major influence.
Wonder why they didn't get bigger in the national scene.
It was just kind of timing. They didn't have, and they also weren't kids. At a time when the R&B was dominated by Young and Beautiful. They were a little bit scruffier than that, a little bit longer in the tooth, almost like Chuck Berry or something.
Yeah.
And they did well. They had top 10 R&B hits. A couple of them went to #1, but they never really crossed over. They had songs that crossed over, but done by others. So the lightning that struck for Ray Charles and some of the other of their contemporaries just never quite happened for them. They did make
They really just had that one song that became a hit, dedicated to the One I Love.
Dedicated to the One I Loved, yeah. And they had some others. Lots of James Brown and others have done that. James Brown's landmark live album, Live at the Apollo Theater from 1962, has some Five Royale songs in the set list. So yeah, they definitely were an influence, not a well-remembered one. They did get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame belatedly 5 years ago. Unfortunately, all of them had passed before that happened, which was too bad.
Well, I didn't know they'd gotten in the Hall of Fame. So who was next in your book?
Well, that Doc Watson fellow, his chapter
Yes,
6.
I remember him.
Well, the American folk revival comes to North Carolina, Doc Watson. That's that chapter. And then from there, we go to the beach, breaking color lines at the beach. Beach music is, I found it fascinating and weird when I got here. I remember a conversation with my editor where the phrase beach music came up and I didn't know what it meant. And I asked her what, like the Beach Boys, and she laughed at me and said, "Oh, bless your heart." So, it was a real gateway North Carolina experience there.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. But yeah, beach music, it was, when I got here, it was cover bands playing old stuff in these parking lot gigs. But the history of it, the origins of it, is really tied up with segregation in the Jim Crow South.
Talk about that.
Yeah, it started as white kids on vacation at the beach sneaking across the tracks to the African American joints to hear the sort of forbidden fruit of dirty R&B like the Five Royales on jukeboxes over there, and also cop dance moves. And it turned into this just sort of cool little subculture. And after a few years, those white kids grew up and went off to college, and they took the music with them. And this whole Chitlin circuit, frat houses on Southern University started up, like that scene in Animal House where they're playing the Isley Brothers at the toga party at the fraternity. That was kind of the beach music scene in the 1960s.
And how long did that last, or is it still going strong down there?
It is still going, and it's gone inland too. I mean, there's thriving little sectors of it in Raleigh and Charlotte, and as well as resort towns at the coast. Still, the original canon of beach music records, those acts died out. But other bands came along and formed in their wake, like the Embers, who've been around for 62 years.
Wow.
They're still at it. So yeah, they formed in 1958.
Wow.
So yeah, a venerable, long-lived style.
I guess so. Well, it was such a danceable thing. I mean, doing the shag was easy and funky and fun.
Yeah. The ideal shag tempo, 110 to 130 beats per minute.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's go back and talk about Doc. We don't want to skip that.
Oh, yeah.
We know something about.
Well, yeah. I mean, and as you noted, we could just talk all night about Doc. He was an amazing character. I feel like I should just yield the floor to you, who knew him well.
Yeah. Well, he was the best musician I ever came across, all told, I would say, that I've ever played with. And, people could play faster and more notes and trickier moves, but nobody played it with the taste, the timing, and the tone that Doc had. And all of his solos kind of told a little story. And, there was feeling in each one. He was a funny guy. He was, since he was blind, blind people have a lot of time to think. And so he would think about his songs and sort of digest them, make up stories about the characters. I remember he used to do a song called "I'll Rise When the Rooster Crows." And it's just a simple, probably minstrel show melody. I'll rise when the rooster crows, I'll rise when the rooster crows. I'm going back south to when the sun shines hot, down where the sugar cane grows. That's the chorus. And he made up this whole story about the character who had to go up north and leave his people down in the south. And he was getting ready to go out to the south and see his girl again. He had the whole character of the song told in his head. And later I found out that that's basically what all great singers do. Barbra Streisand, Frank Sinatra, they all think about the characters in the story as an actor would, thinking about their part. And Doc really got deeply involved. Plus, he was a guy that his emotions were on his sleeve, and they could change very quickly. I remember one time we were riding along and he said, I'm so mad at Thomas Edison. He said, I could just box his ears. I said, Doc, what? Thomas Edison died about 100 years ago, I think is correct. He said, I don't care. He was so mean to Tesla. He told Tesla he'd give him $50,000 and ended up giving him nothing. And Tesla had to dig ditches for a living. I said, good grief, Doc, give it up. But he could get really angry about something like that really fast. And he could put that same energy in a song. And that's why I think he never sang real big. He never sang loud, but he put feeling in every song, which is remarkable the way he did it.
Yeah, you know, he's remembered primarily for his guitar playing, but he
Yeah.
a really underrated singer too.
Oh yeah, he was a great singer and of course a great guitar player and any other thing he picked up. He's so musical, just deeply inside his body. And not a particularly musical family. It was just, he was a little 15-year-old blind kid listening to the radio, trying to figure out stuff off the radio because he knew he might only hear it once. And he was able to do stuff like the Beaumont rag, which are very complicated pieces. He learned it off the radio.
I'm still thinking about Doc as engineer and just imagining the things he would have built. It would have been amazing, I'm sure.
That's true. He was so proud of the things he did build. He made a shed out in back of his house where he kept his tools and stuff. And it was about maybe 12 foot by 12 foot. And he did it all himself with measuring, cutting, nailing, putting it all together. It was just perfectly made. I went over to his house one time and he was on the roof in regular leather shoes. On the roof, there was a ladder, and I pulled up, and I'm looking up, and I see Doc working on the TV antenna in leather bottom shoes, which could have slid off like crazy. And then I said, Doc, aren't you afraid to be up there? He said, no, I know where the ladder is. And he gets down on his knees, and he comes over to the ladder, and he just comes right down. And another time I went over to his house, and it was completely dark. He said, come on in here, David. I'm in the back room. Well, I couldn't see anything. It was just pitch black, and I fumbled along the walls. And I said, what you doing in here, Doc? He's in the back room. He said, I'm fixing this radio. And he had a soldering iron and just his bare fingers. And he was soldering the tubes and different things in the radio to make it work. In the dark.
In the dark, of course.
He said, you can turn on the light if you want. It won't do me any good, but you can. Yeah, he was pretty amazing.
Yeah, there's lots of Doc stories. I'm sure my colleague Eddie Huffman has spoken to you for the Doc Watson book that he's working on. So
right.
I eagerly await that. That's also coming on UNC Press and should be next year if Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
Yeah, I'll look forward to that. Eddie's a good guy.
Yeah, indeed.
So who was next in your book?
Who is next? From after Beach is the band Nantucket. Kind of the
I didn't know them really. Tell us about.
Yeah, they're like the definitive 70s North Carolina rock band.
And did they get pretty famous?
You know, regionally, they absolutely ruled the Carolinas, but they never broke out nationally. They're in the North Carolina Music Hall of Fame. What I found most interesting about them is they actually started out as a beach band, oddly enough. In 1969 in Jacksonville, they were called Stacks of Gold. And they played all the R&B hits, the same ones everybody else did. Then Woodstock happened that summer, and they changed directions in a hurry, and wound up looking kind of like the band in the movie Almost Famous. You know, wearing the leather.
Oh yeah.
And
so what was their music like at that point?
It was like a harder rock version of the Doobie Brothers. They still had the horns. That's the funny thing about them. They turned into a rock band, but never stopped being a beach band either. And they still had a lot of elements of funk and R&B in there. And it's pretty peppy stuff. They had some songs you could totally imagine being on the radio. There were bands like them that wound up being very successful. There was one in particular in the mid 80s called The Outfield that you'd swore was the same band. And they had they had hits and Nantucket didn't. But
management.
Yeah, you know, just as I tell people, if you're going to have a hit, there's about 189 things that have to go right. And all it takes is one or two things to screw up, bad links in that chain, and it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That said, they're still at it all these years later. So,
Oh, they're still going.
They are still going. Yeah.
Wow.
They had a few periods where they were broken up, but never for all that long, just a year or two at a time. So yeah, they've been at it for 50 years, basically.
Wow. And if you had to describe their music, what would you say?
So,
who would you compare them to?
Who would I compare them to? I mentioned the Doobie Brothers in the outfield.
Oh.
They did a lot of touring with AC/DC, and they weren't quite that heavy, but that kind of metallic pop rock. So yeah, if you can imagine AC/DC with a horn section, that's kind of what they were like.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go listen to more of that. That sounds interesting. So who was next?
After Nantucket, Mitch Easter and Winston-Salem, Combo Corner. Mitch Easter is best known for having co-produced REM's first couple of records. And he came up in a very intriguing scene in Winston-Salem. Kids there, where they were forming beach bands in places like Jacksonville down the coast. In Winston-Salem, they were forming bands that were more like the Beatles or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, or the Move. And he grew up with a tape recorder that his family had as a Christmas gift one year, just trying to figure out how to make the sounds he heard on the radio. And he wound up as kind of a genius level producer with his own studio. His first studio was in the garage of his parents' house in Winston-Salem. Wow. So yeah, bands like REM, that's where he was recording them.
Where were they from? I heard
REM was from Athens, Georgia.
Oh,
and very connected to North Carolina. It was the first place they played outside of Athens, was at Chapel Hill, a little club called The Station, right by where Elizabeth Cotten grew up.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is chapter 9. There were other bands like the DBs, also from Winston-Salem, that were, fairly sizable on the 80s college radio.
Did you have a hard time choosing, or was it pretty obvious who you needed to have?
It was kind of obvious. A lot of it, there were some tough calls. Who to leave in, who to leave out, who gets full length chapters and who gets sidebars. Part of it was like, who's the best story, and the one that seemed to fit into this the best. Like there's a chapter further down, songs of immigrants and emigrants, people who were from North Carolina but left, or people who moved here from somewhere else. And the person to kind of best frame that around was Nina Simone. Could have chosen John Coltrane or Thelonious Monk, but she was kind of around here just long enough and to be the best story. And also there's sort of still more traces of her around, like that cabin she was born in and grew up in Tryon is just amazing to go see. I would recommend it to anybody to kind of understand why African Americans in the 1930s would flee northward. A fairly graphic example of what life was like back then. But it's this little like 600 square foot cabin, and I think there were 9 people living in it, or some insane amount of people like that.
Yeah, yeah. Is she after the in Nantucket?
Yeah, that was chapter 14. I skipped ahead a little bit. From Winston-Salem, there's a chapter on Chapel Hill during its kind of next Seattle era in the 90s. After Nirvana blew up, record companies were looking all over for, where's the next hot boom town for alternative rock? And Chapel Hill had a lot of bands like that. So they came around and a lot of them got record deals. But the bands from Chapel Hill that wound up being popular were the Squirrel Nut Zippers, who played old time jazz, and a piano pop trio called Ben Folds 5. It was
right. Those were the people that really made it.
Yeah. They were the last 2 bands anybody would have guessed would go platinum and have million selling records, but they did. Did that have to do with Chapel Hill at all, or any reason why you can picture or say that happened? Well, Chapel Hill is, it was just sort of it was and is kind of an anything goes kind of place. It's always been a town and a scene where you could do your thing and get by pretty well no matter what it was and how idiosyncratic or off the beaten path it was. Squirrel Nut Zippers almost started out as this art project more than a band. You know, they formed at potluck parties where people would bring instruments and just play this old-timey music. And after a while, they thought it'd be fun to do a show. So they did one, and it was almost like a recital at this restaurant. And it was so popular, they just kept doing it. And then they were playing weddings, and then the occasional show. And then before they knew it, they were suddenly on MTV, and things got really strange. So, yeah.
They're back together, aren't they?
Yes and no. The classic hit lineup of the band will never reunite because they had extremely bitter falling out. You know, the usual reasons. But it seems like there wasn't a single marriage or friendship that survived what they went through. And it was really too bad.
Because
So,
of the fame?
beg pardon?
Because of the fame?
That had a lot to do with it, yes. You know, too much too fast. And yeah, it was a thing too. It's not like anybody was expecting this to happen. And they started out with very egalitarian spirit, and that just got old in a hurry. They got on this treadmill that kind of undid them.
Yeah.
So one of them, Jimbo Mathis, one of the co-founders, still owns the name, and he keeps them going. They're basically based in New Orleans now. They're not from around here anymore.
Oh, is that right? Oh,
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so who was next?
After that, there's a chapter about record labels, oddly enough. One of those Chapel Hill punk bands from the 90s, Superchunk, had their own record company called Merge Records that wound up being enormously successful. They won the Album of the Year Grammy in 2011 with a band called Arcade Fire from Montreal. And they had started out basically run out of a band member's bedroom. And they'd have parties where they'd stuff singles into sleeves and invite friends over and give them beer to help. So yeah, that was Merge Records early on, and then they blew up into a much bigger deal. So, and there were a number of other notable labels in North Carolina. Colonial Records, they did the original version of the Andy Griffith monologue. What it was football.
Yeah.
And George Hamilton IV, some of his big hits were on Colonial too. That was a little Chapel Hill label. And my idea of a joke, the chapter about record labels is chapter 11, the bankruptcy code number, because that's what happens to most of them.
Most of them, yeah.
And then after that, there's a chapter about Americana bands, which is Americana, and I'm thinking of the sort of alternative country bands. It's kind of ebbed and flowed. His Golden Messenger, are you familiar with them? They're kind of top of the heap right now.
Yeah.
But it goes way back to Red Clay Ramblers in the 70s and Southern Culture on the Skids in the 80s, and then bands like Whiskey Town and Six String Drag in the 90s. And it continues today. His Golden Messenger is pretty amazing, and it's this whole little constellation collective with all these other bands and spinoffs. Sylvan Esso, who are an electronic band, got a Grammy nomination a few years ago. They're kind of part of that same orbit too, oddly enough.
So we've been talking about the music business, basically. What is going to happen? What do you see as happening after the pandemic either stops or just keeps going?
Wow, that is a good question.
We're all out of work. All the musicians,
yes.
All the work was canceled.
Yeah, it's really hard to predict how that's going to go. I don't know. I look at the local scene in my area, and it seems like Cat's Cradle will probably survive, and every other club, it's 50-50 at best.
Really?
They're going to somehow open their doors on the other side of this. I don't know
Would
how.
you see any bands busting loose or solo people that are busting loose that we might look for?
Well, yeah. There's a fellow named Jonathan Bird.
Oh, I love Jonathan Bird.
Yeah, and have you watched his Wednesday night thing he does at the Kraken in Chapel Hill every week?
No, but I've been to a bunch of his shows up here in Asheville.
He does this thing, Jonathan Bird's Americana Showcase at the Kraken, and he had started working on how to do a professionally produced webcast show, and he's got the gear for it. He's got it dialed in. He knows how to do it. I mean, you know, it's like watching an Austin City Limits show or something. It's kind of that level. He's figured out how to do this, and everybody else is sort of trying to figure out what's next. And they're doing drive-in shows, and you can do a certain amount of stuff
on YouTube. Then his show.
I think you can find it on social media, like his Facebook page. I do believe it's on YouTube as well. So yeah, well worth looking at.
We've been talking the whole time. You want to read something? Because I know we're going to have questions here in a minute.
Yeah, let me just. I'm just going to read the part about you.
Well, dang.
This is from. Yeah, here it is.
Look, oh, there's books made already, huh? I've just got the.
We'll get you a real one. This is page 98. There's the full-length chapters, like the one on Doc, and then there's little sidebars in each one that are related. And you're in the Doc chapter. Carrying it forward, David Holt. Born in 1946 in Texas and raised in California, David Holt's North Carolina family roots and musicological bent led him to Asheville, where he moved in 1973. Another young folkie, captivated by anthology of American folk music, Holt began seeking out the old-time masters after Ralph Stanley advised him to start going to fiddle conventions in North Carolina and Virginia. David would go into the backwoods, find these old guys, and learn. Mickey Gamble, founder of the Arden-based label Crossroads Music, told me in 2016. Every weekend, he and his wife would have a big gathering of young musicians with a few older guys, an old-time picking thing. After dinner, there'd be 40 people sitting in a big circle, playing and learning. David's very much a planner, and he and his wife mapped out how to get there. It started with learning to play everything, and he did. Holt connected with Wade Maynor, Etta Baker, Tommy Gerald, Doc Watson, and many others, compiling an impressive collection of photographs and recordings. He was Watson's regular sideman for more than a decade and appeared on television and radio programs, including Hee Haw, Grand Ole Opry, and his own State of Music. And eventually, he evolved from apprentice to mentor, grooming younger musicians like the Western North Carolina picker Josh Goforth to carry the music forward. It's what I always expected and hoped for, that someone like Josh would come along, Holt told me in 2016. He's super talented and can absorb some of the things I have to offer and make them his own. The great thing about Josh is his relatives are people I learned from in my 20s before he was born, so he never met them. This is a way of paying that back and taking it full circle, mentoring this young mountain guy who's become a world-class musician.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you both, Davids. But perhaps reading that excerpt about David Holt is a very high note to end this interview part. But we did want to allow a few minutes for questions from those tuning in, and that includes you, David Holt. You can continue to ask questions, but David, I would like to ask you a question that's my favorite question, and one that is from my own experience in being a book author, and that is, as you get inside a story, there are revelations, there are surprises, there are things of significance you didn't anticipate. What are some of those elements from your own journey with the North Carolina story of music?
Well, one of them was beach music. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't something I took particularly seriously, but then when I got into the history and where it came from, it was really a fascinating story. I do honestly find the history and the background more interesting than where it kind of wound up. But that wound up, that might be my favorite chapter in the book, in part because it was the most kind of from the ground up. There were a lot of other chapters where I had sort of roadmaps. Like with Doc, I did a number of fairly lengthy stories about him over the years, and those were pretty good roadmaps. There were some pretty cool little weird Easter eggs. Like, I was fascinated and geeked out to learn that the same slime ball record guy was in charge of the recording careers of both Charlie Poole and Arthur Smith. A guy named Frank Waller from Columbia Records. And Charlie Poole, he kind of got bored at a certain point with the old timey stuff and wanted to go in more of a polished pop, sophisticated direction. You could imagine him turning into Bob Wills eventually. And in fact, that same label guy signed Bob Wills years later. So it's really too bad he didn't let Charlie Poole follow his muse. There was also, let's see if I can show this. a picture that I don't think has appeared anywhere else that I was quite happy to have in. I don't know if you can see that, but
Yeah.
that is a fellow by the name of J.B. Long. And he was the dollar store manager in first Kinston and then Durham. And he had kind of a freelance recording operation. And he recorded Blind Boy Fuller. And they recorded it over 100 sides, and they've never gone out of print. And that's one reason Blind Boy Fuller is so well remembered, that this J.B. Long guy came around and made records with him. It wasn't all happiness and sunshine. Money was a constant sticking point, you know. There was a lot of bickering involved, but thanks to J.B. Long, Blind Boy Fuller is pretty well remembered, and I was happy to get that photo. His grandson, J.B. Long's grandson had it, so that was a cool little find.
It's interesting to note that you couldn't buy records at a record store because there were no record stores, and they were either a shoe store or usually a furniture store, because they also sold the recorder. I mean, the players. Yeah. And that's where you found it. That guy was, you know, very important in North Carolina record history.
He figured out that if he played music, people stuck around longer in the store. And that led to him carrying them and selling them, and people would come in asking for things, and he, you know, got pretty good at name that tune. And then disaster records like Wreck of the Old 97, those were a thing back then. And there was this grisly accident in Lumberton, the Lumberton wreck, where a train hit a truckload of farmers. People were asking, is there a record about that? And he found out there wasn't one, and the record company told him he should make one. So he did. And that's how he got started.
I'll be darned.
David, Chase Barnard has that's an observation that could be a question too, but clearly one of the more colorful bands that we all late night would sometimes experience. And that would be Doug Clark and the Hot Nuts, who were still active into the 90s. Did you cross paths with them?
Not really. They're mentioned kind of tangentially in the Beach chapter. That should be a book unto itself. Those guys. In fact, I've had conversations with a few people who've toyed with the idea of doing it, and I've certainly encouraged it. I hope a Doug Clark book gets written. That's quite a tale.
Yeah. We also had a question about the whole dynamic of interviewing, which I know from experience, and David Holt is the master of it. But what were some of the dynamics or elements of drawing people out the way David did with David Holt in your getting their story?
Is that for me or for Mr. Holt?
That's for you.
Okay.
In terms of,
you know, a lot of the time, you know, I did use a lot of interviews that I conducted for the paper, and those were frequently done with an agenda, you know, a specific story. I'd be interviewing the Avett brothers about some benefit they were playing or whatnot. So I kind of had a leg up there. I wasn't coming in cold a lot of the time. And that was a pretty good way in. And also, just because I've been here for so long, I got to be a familiar face that people came to know and maybe trust. You know, people like Tiff Merritt, who I've interviewed dozens of times over the years, and you know, it's always very cordial and very friendly. That's the good part of sticking around in a place. You get some currency with the locals, and they're willing to tell their story.
another question, David, is about, and you've touched on this already, but the ingredients that have gone into making North Carolina really a music land. You mentioned a day job state, meaning I think that a lot of music has been close to the roots, close to the day jobs, close to the factory. In addition to that, what other ingredients have you experienced over your 28 years, as well as the book, that have made North Carolina such a music land?
Well, the gospel roots are never far away. You know, in the South, that's just going to be a thing. Yeah. And they're certainly very close to the roots. I remember talking to people about American Idol. That's another chapter in the book. It's the last one. Yeah. And over the show's 15-year run, 3 winners came from North Carolina. You know, 20% of their winners from one state, which is pretty remarkable. And then a lot of also very influential, popular also-rans who didn't win. but you know, asking people why. And more than one person said church singing. It's kind of the perfect background for that kind of pop stardom. So you've got that. You've got the working class populist traditions we mentioned earlier. Also education. You know, you've got all these university towns with these world-class universities throwing young people together at an impressionable time, and bands tend to come together in the midst of all that. Not just rock bands. North Carolina hip hop is a real thing, and it tends to be concentrated on campus. Some of the most important, best known hip hop groups from the state formed on campus at Shaw University or North Carolina Central.
In fact, you have a chapter on that. Chapter 15 is about hip hop goes to college.
I do.
Anything you want to add on that one? Because you didn't really get to it too much in your interview.
Yeah, that was the focus of that one. Is Ninth Wonder, who was the producer DJ of the group Little Brother, and has gone on to quite a career as a hip hop academic while still doing studio work. He teaches at Duke, at Central. He's done stints at Harvard. There was a documentary about him about 5 years ago called The Hip Hop Fellow. And he's a very intriguing example of turning something into a career in a way that you wouldn't expect. He never got a degree, but he's a professor in practice. And yeah, he's quite a guy.
Another issue that's been with me a long time, and you have alluded to it, but we had a question about it, and that is, would you care to expand a bit on how, particularly the early music, R&B and others, really had a role in civil rights in bringing down the barriers? It was the young people's music in my day. We wanted to go hear the R&B stuff. We didn't care about Perry Como. You might comment, if you would, about how it was such a force for bringing down the fences in the civil rights movement. Not talking about the 60s folk music as much as those early groups, the African-American groups that had really engaged the young white teenagers.
Well, yeah, you know, there'd be venues where they were segregated, either upstairs, downstairs, or a rope down the middle, and that never seemed to last. You know, there was always mingling going on that the authorities didn't approve of, and that was important. You know, it certainly got people together on both sides of the divide in important ways. And also North Carolina is sort of a font of protest music, Nina Simone especially. I mean, you know, Mississippi Goddamn was one of the anthems of the civil rights movement. And it was written in response to some pretty heinous crimes like the Birmingham church bombing. So yeah, the righteous anger of it very much has roots in North Carolina as well.
Just to add a personal note, as a teenager, the Greensboro Tobacco Warehouse, when it was not doing tobacco warehousing, would have some of the R&B bands. And I heard Clyde McFadder and the Drifters, and they had a chicken wire fence down the middle to separate blacks and whites. That fence lasted about 2 minutes, and everybody was dancing with everybody else. And this young teenager had his eyes open. This was a straw in the wind. David Holt, anything, we're down to our last 2 or 3 minutes. Anything you want to close on here and asking David?
We skipped over Earl Scruggs, and I think that would be a mistake to not have his name mentioned, because he was, to have a guy change the way an instrument is played forever is pretty remarkable. And he was such a sweet, wonderful guy.
Yeah.
Anything you want to say about old Earl?
Oh yeah, I can't believe I did that. Thank you for correcting that. You know, just the fact that bluegrass banjo is called Scruggs style.
Yeah.
You know, that's sort of says it all. He was just amazing. I briefly thought about making one chapter cover both Earl and Doc before deciding I just couldn't do it. They were both too separately important to lump together like that, but a very similar kind of modesty. And, you know, people tell stories about how droll he could be in a very deadpan way. Yeah. But just, you know, he played banjo in a way nobody'd ever heard. Other people were trying to do that kind of style, but just faster, cleaner, bigger, more, the thing sounded like a rocket. And yeah, if there's a few things I'd go see if I had a time machine. One is Charlie Poole. Another is that first time at the Grand Ole Opry where Earl Scruggs played with Bill Monroe, and it was
Oh my.
sensation. That would have been incredible.
And got a bunch of ovations, didn't they, that time?
Yes, yes, they did.
Yeah. I love the story about how he and his brother would start on an instrument in the front of the house,
Yeah,
trying to keep time, and walk around the house, each going a different direction, and then meet on the other side of the house and hopefully be right in time together. And they could do that. That's the kind of timing he had.
I always love that too, where he figured out the style and was playing Reuben, and his brother came home and he just kept doing it. And his brother finally goes, "Is that all you know?"
Yeah, right. It's a great book, and I think it's going to be really informative for a lot of people. Everybody's going to enjoy some part of it and the whole thing if you really want to know about North Carolina music. Good job, David.
Great job, David. And there is such a rich story. And David Holt, well done in drawing out so many issues, but you can't cover everything. So David Menconi has offered to field any questions some of our viewers have had that maybe we didn't get to or you haven't thought of yet. Is that so, David? And could you maybe through Malaprops or UNC Press share your email?
Of course, yes. I'll put it in the little chat thing here, but it's dlmenconi@gmail. And pretty responsive most of the time. Hit me up. Ask away.
A great night with the two Davids. Thank you both so much. In fact, you had a conversation interviewing each other, and I love that. So thank you both. You're a treasure to North Carolina. I'll turn it back to Stephanie, I think, to sign off.
And I'm also here in case Stephanie has stepped away. I'm Patricia. I'm also a bookseller. It's always a pleasure to hear the reminiscences and observations of people who are steeped in the music of not only the state of North Carolina, but really the nation. And thinking about Earl Scruggs and thinking about Nina Simone, Squirrel Nut Zipper. I just I loved all these references, and learned about a new documentary, Hip Hop Fellow. I tried to put those in the chat. So we'll be posting this event video on our YouTube channel later, or when we get it edited. So I really want to thank David Menconi and David Holt and Doug Orr for being here. We appreciate your contribution to making people more informed and really more creatively aware of what, not just the state, but even beach music. Who knew? Who knew? I think you did something important there, David. Thank you so much for informing us. And we look forward to having you in the store at some point when it's safe. And we can do it in a welcoming way. So we've got your email address there, David, at the bottom.
I'll just jump in. I haven't been feeling well, and so I just took myself off camera to not share any unpleasant images with people. But I just want to give a big ditto to everything that Patricia said, and thank you all so much. Thank you, David Menconi. Thank you, David Holt, and thank you, Doug Orr. And the book is a wonderful resource for North Carolinians and people outside North Carolina alike. Also want to say thank you again to UNC Press for all of the work that the press does, and for partnering with us on the series of events that we've been doing with them. We're pleased to do it. And thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. We really appreciate your support at Malaprops. And it's thanks to our community that we've been around for 38 years and continue even at this sort of challenging time. So thank you so much. And Patricia was posting all the links in the chat. So I recommend saving that chat before you leave, because there's lots of wonderful information in there, in addition to the link to purchase the book and David's email address. So thank you all again so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.